7:14 p.m. The cicadas had just begun their nightly sermon, a high, electric hum that settled over the manicured lawns of Oak Street. It was the sound of suburban peace, a fragile truce between the fading daylight and the encroaching dark. That peace was shattered by a single, piercing scream. It was not the playful shriek of a child in a game of tag, nor the brief cry of a scraped knee. This was a sound stripped of all childhood, thin and sharp and full of a terror that clawed its way through screened-in porches and closed windows. On her porch, Eleanor Gable paused her watering can, the stream of water faltering over her wilting petunias. She looked toward the street, her brow furrowed. She saw the tail end of it. A dark, featureless sedan, the kind that looked expensive and anonymous, pulling away from the curb too quickly. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a small hand, fingers splayed against the rear window, before it vanished. She told herself it was a tantrum, just a father struggling to get his overtired daughter into her car seat. She had seen it 100 times. Still, the sound lingered in the humid air, a dissonant chord that refused to resolve. She went inside and picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly as she dialed 911. The voice on the other end was flat, bored. 911, what's your emergency? Eleanor described what she heard, what she thought she saw. The dispatcher's reply was coded in a thick lacquer of weary procedure. A child yelling, "Ma'am?" and a black car. A sigh crackled through the receiver. It's dinner time, probably just a kid not wanting to go home. We get these calls all the time. The dismissal was so complete, so automatic, that Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment, as if she were a fool who had mistaken a common sparrow for a bird of prey. "Yes, I suppose you're right," she mumbled and hung up. The system had spoken. It was nothing. But miles away, in the quiet hills that ringed the city, a man named Preacher sat on the tailgate of his truck, cleaning a carburetor part with a stained rag. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, a primal unease he hadn't felt since his last tour overseas. He didn't know why. He looked up at the twilight sky, at the first pale stars emerging from the deep blue, and the feeling did not pass. An engine turned over somewhere in the valley below, a low, guttural rumble that sounded, to him, like a promise. Marcus Thorne smelled of grease and solvent when he walked through the door at 8:02 p.m. It was a smell he couldn't scrub away, the scent of a 16-hour double shift at the auto shop, the price of keeping his small 2-bedroom apartment and putting food on the table for his daughter, Lily. The first thing he always did, before kicking off his steel-toed boots or even setting down his lunchbox, was find her. Usually, she'd be in the living room, curled on the sofa with a book, or at the kitchen table, her tongue stuck out in concentration as she drew fantastical creatures. Tonight, the apartment was silent. The only light came from the small lamp he'd left on in the hall. "Lily Bean?" he called out, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. No answer. A flicker of annoyance turned quickly to a cold spike of dread. He checked her room. Her bed was neatly made, a row of stuffed animals standing guard on her pillow. He checked the bathroom. Empty. Back in the living room, his eyes scanned the floor and snagged on something small and brown. It was Barnaby, the one-eyed teddy bear she'd had since she was a baby, the one she never, ever went anywhere without. It lay on its side near the front door, its single button eye staring up at the ceiling. The world tilted on its axis. He fumbled for his phone, his grease-stained fingers slipping on the screen as he dialed 911. The minutes it took for the cruiser to arrive felt like years. Detective Carver stepped out, a man whose posture seemed to have been permanently stooped by the weight of civic apathy. He was thick in the middle, his tie loosened, his eyes scanning Marcus's worn-out furniture and peeling paint with a look of weary resignation. He listened to Marcus's frantic explanation with a placid, almost bored expression. "Mr. Thorne," Carver began, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "How old is your daughter?" 7, Marcus said, his own voice tight with panic. "She'll be 8 next month," Carver made a note on a small pad. "Any friends in the building?" "In the neighborhood. A few, but she knows the rules. She's not allowed outside alone after dark. She would never just leave." Not without Barnaby, he pointed at the bear. Carver glanced at the toy and then back at Marcus, his gaze lingering on the grime under Marcus's fingernails. Look, kids do this, the detective said, a condescending edge to his tone. They get mad about something, they run off to a friend's house to teach you a lesson. She'll turn up when she gets hungry. Marcus felt a surge of hot anger. This isn't that. Something is wrong. A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, she called you. She heard a scream. She saw a car. Carver flipped a page in his notebook. We have a record of the call. She reported a child yelling, said it herself, it was probably a tantrum. We can't issue an Amber Alert based on a maybe. We have procedures, Mr. Thorne. A 24-hour waiting period for runaways. She is not a runaway, Marcus insisted, his voice cracking. Carver closed his notebook with a soft snap, a sound of finality. I've been doing this for 20 years. 99 times out of 100, they walk through that door tomorrow morning, complaining about breakfast. We'll put out a local bulletin, have the patrol cars keep an eye out. Try to get some sleep. She'll probably be back before you wake up. He walked out, leaving Marcus standing in the suffocating silence of his empty home. The detective's indifference a heavier blow than any physical assault. The system had looked at him, at his life, and decided it was ordinary, not worth the alarm. The silence in the apartment was a physical entity. It pressed in on Marcus, filled the spaces where Lily's laughter should have been. He walked into her room and sat on the edge of her small bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. The indentation from her head was still on the pillow. He picked it up and held it to his face, inhaling the faint, sweet scent of her shampoo. It was the smell of bubblegum and innocence, and it broke something deep inside him. He was a mechanic, a man who understood how things worked. Engines, transmissions, electrical systems, they were all puzzles with logical solutions. You just had to find the broken part and replace it. This was different. This was a gaping void where the most vital component of his life used to be. His wife, Sarah, had died 3 years ago, a sudden vicious illness that had torn through her in a matter of months. In the wreckage of his grief, Lily had been his anchor, his reason to get out of bed, to keep turning wrenches and paying bills. She had her mother's eyes, a deep, thoughtful blue, and a smile that could coax the sun from behind the clouds. He saw a piece of paper taped to her wall, a crayon drawing of 2 figures holding hands. One was tall with messy brown hair, labeled Daddy. The other was a small girl with a wild mane of yellow scribbles, labeled Lily. Above them, a smiling sun shone down. Underneath, in her wobbly 7-year-old print, she had written, "My best friend." He remembered the day she drew it, just last week. They had spent the afternoon at the kitchen table, not with crayons, but with tiny plastic pieces and a tube of glue, assembling a model of a P-51 Mustang. It was his way of connecting with her, sharing a piece of his own past. Before he was a mechanic, he was a sergeant in the Air Force, a crew chief who kept real warbirds flying. He'd tell her stories, not of combat, but of the camaraderie, the shared purpose, the unspoken code among the men on the flight line. "We never left a plane unfixed, Lily Bean," he told her. "And we never left a man behind." She'd listened with wide-eyed fascination, carefully dabbing glue onto a propeller blade. Now, the finished model sat on her dresser, a silent testament to a life that felt a million miles away. He stood up and walked to the small balcony off the living room. Their tiny container garden was there, her tomato plants, his herbs. She loved checking on the single, stubborn green tomato every morning, convinced it would be red by afternoon. The concrete beneath his feet felt cold and hard. The stakes were not abstract. They were the weight of her small hand in his, the sound of her humming as she colored, the sight of her sleeping face in the glow of her nightlight. He was not just a father who had lost a child. He was a man whose entire universe had been hollowed out, leaving only the crushing gravity of her absence. This was the human cost, a debt the world seemed unwilling to acknowledge. The first 24 hours bled into a gray, sleepless fog. Marcus didn't wait for the police. He started his own investigation, fueled by coffee and a cold, simmering rage. He walked the block around his apartment building again and again, his eyes scanning the pavement, the gutters, the grass. Near the spot where Mrs. Gable had seen the sedan, something caught the morning light. He knelt, his bad knee cracking in protest, and picked it up. It was a shard of red plastic, curved and ridged, clearly from a vehicle's taillight assembly. He turned it over in his hand. On the inside, stamped into the plastic, was a small, intricate logo and a part number. He knew cars. This wasn't from a cheap domestic model. This was German. Expensive. He carefully placed the fragment in a plastic bag and went to talk to his neighbors. Most offered useless sympathy. But Mr. Henderson on the third floor, a tech nerd who worked from home, had a security camera pointed out his window. "It's mostly for package thieves," he said, pulling up the footage on his laptop. "The quality isn't great at night." Marcus leaned over his shoulder, his heart pounding. There it was. 7:13 p.m. A sleek, black sedan pulling up to the curb. The resolution was grainy, the light poor, but the shape was unmistakable. A man gets out of the driver's side, moves out of frame. A minute later, he reappears, forcing a small, struggling figure into the back seat. "Lily." The car peels away. "Can you get the plate?" Marcus asked, his voice a raw whisper. Mr. Henderson zoomed in. The numbers and letters were a blurry, pixelated mess. "I'm sorry, man. It's just a white smear," but it was something. It was proof. He took the plastic fragment and a USB drive with the video file straight to the precinct. He had to wait 45 minutes before Detective Carver would even see him. Carver looked at the baggie with the plastic shard and barely glanced at the USB drive. "Mr. Thorne, I appreciate your trying to help," he said, the words dripping with condescension. "But this doesn't prove anything. It's a piece of plastic. Could have been on that street for weeks. And a blurry video of a black car? There are thousands of them in this city. It's a high-end German car," Marcus insisted, his control slipping. "Look at the logo. That narrows it down. My daughter is missing. You have to do something." Carver leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest. "What we have," he said slowly, as if explaining a complex concept to a simpleton, "is a father with a history of financial trouble and a daughter who, according to school records, has been acting out a bit since her mother's passing. It's a classic profile for a parental dispute or a runaway scenario. We are not launching a citywide manhunt for a luxury car based on a piece of trash and a grainy video. It's a waste of resources." The accusation hung in the air. That Marcus himself was somehow to blame, or that his daughter's life was simply not a resource worth expending. The system wasn't just failing. It was actively working against him, turning his grief and fear into a bureaucratic annoyance. He walked out of the precinct and into the harsh sunlight, the feeling of helplessness a physical weight in his chest. 48 hours had now passed. The city moved on around him, oblivious. No news reports, no Amber Alert. No one was looking for Lily, no one but him, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the empty space opposite him a screaming accusation. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His mind was a frantic loop of worst-case scenarios, each more horrific than the last. He had hit a wall. The police were a dead end. The media wasn't interested. He was just one man, a grease monkey with no money and no influence, shouting into a void. His gaze fell on an old, battered footlocker in the corner of the room, the one that held his Air Force memorabilia. He hadn't opened it in years. He knelt and unlatched it. On top lay his neatly folded dress blues. Beneath them, photo albums, medals, and a small, worn address book. He flipped through the pages, a roll call of ghosts from another life. And then he saw the name, Preacher. He hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. They had served together in Afghanistan, two young men maintaining billion-dollar aircraft in a dust-choked war zone. Preacher, whose real name was Elias Vance, had been different, quieter, more intense. He saw the world in black and white, in codes of honor and unbreakable loyalties. He'd left the service under a cloud, disillusioned with the bureaucracy and the politics. The last Marcus heard, he'd found a different kind of brotherhood, one that rode on 2 wheels and wore leather cuts. The Hell's Angels. Marcus hesitated. Calling preacher felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. He had always been a man who believed in the system, in the rule of law. But the system had failed him. The law had abandoned his daughter. His hand shook as he dialed the number, half praying it was disconnected. It rang 3 times, then a low, calm voice answered. "Yeah, preacher? This is Marcus Thorne. We served together." At Bagram there was a long pause on the other end. Marcus could almost hear the gears turning, the memories being accessed. "Thorne, crew chief on the Raptors. You had a light touch with a torque wrench." The voice was unchanged, still possessing that unnerving stillness. "Yeah, that was me." Marcus took a breath, the words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation. About Lily, the police, Carver, the taillight, the video, the crushing indifference of it all. He laid his failure and his fear bare. Preacher listened without interruption. The silence on the line wasn't empty. It was heavy, attentive. When Marcus finally ran out of words, his voice choked with emotion. Preacher didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He asked a single, simple question. "Did you serve?" "You know I did," Marcus whispered. "Then we don't leave our people behind," Preacher stated, not as a promise, but as a fundamental law of his universe, as immutable as gravity. Ever. That is the code. Another pause, this one shorter, charged with purpose. "I need 2 things from you, Thorne. The address of the police precinct, and the name of the detective." The catalyst had been found. The switch had been thrown. In that moment, Marcus's desperation was transformed. It was no longer the lonely, helpless grief of a single father. It had been plugged into something larger, something with structure and discipline and a code that valued loyalty above all else. He was no longer just asking for help. He was invoking a law more sacred to these men than any written on the books. He gave Preacher the information. "We'll be there at dawn," Preacher said, and the line went dead. 10 p.m. In a nondescript clubhouse tucked away in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city, Preacher stood before a table. On it lay a phone. He picked it up and made his first call to the president of the neighboring charter. He didn't shout or plead. He spoke in a low, even tone, laying out the facts as Marcus had given them to him. A brother in arms, a veteran. A 7-year-old girl taken. A police force that wouldn't act. He ended the call with a simple statement. "It's time. We ride at dawn." The words spread not like wildfire, but like a current through a perfectly laid grid. Text messages, short and direct, flashed across phone screens in 5 counties. Preacher calls. For the kid. Sunrise, there were no questions, no debates. The code was absolute. The response was immediate. In a garage in a town 50 miles north, a man known as Grizz carefully polished the chrome on his Harley, his massive hands surprisingly gentle. He finished, threw his leg over the seat, and the engine exploded into a deafening roar that shook the rafters. Head count. 1. In a suburban cul-de-sac, a clean-cut accountant named Numbers kissed his sleeping wife, slipped on his leather cut over a button-down shirt, and quietly rolled his bike out of the garage before starting it at the end of the driveway. Head count. 2. The numbers began to multiply. A montage of preparation, a ritual repeated in dozens of garages and workshops. Leather vests being pulled on, the patches and rockers signifying chapters from across the state. Engines turning over, a symphony of controlled thunder. 10 bikes became 20. 20 became 40. Men who were mechanics, contractors, lawyers, and bartenders by day were now united by a single purpose. They weren't a mob. They were an army assembling. The mobilization was precise, disciplined. Each chapter was given a rally point, a route, a time of arrival. The plan was not to intimidate or cause chaos. The plan was to be seen. At 3 a.m., a separate call was made. The recipient was Sarah Jenkins, a young reporter for a small online news outlet, known for her tenacity and her distrust of official narratives. The voice on the phone was anonymous. "Be at the downtown police precinct at 6 a.m. Bring a camera. You're going to want to see this." The call ended. Sarah, sensing the biggest story of her career, didn't hesitate. She called her cameraman. The final piece was in place. This wasn't just about showing up. It was about creating a record. It was about turning a private tragedy into a public accounting. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, small groups of motorcycles began to merge onto the highways, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist. From the north, from the south, from the east. They moved with the quiet efficiency of a military convoy, converging on a single point on the map. The numbers grew. 50, 60, 70, finally, 72. A wave of steel and leather and righteous anger, rolling silently toward a city that was about to wake up to a reckoning. 5:58 a.m. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and pink bleeding into the pale blue of morning. The street in front of the 12th precinct was quiet, save for the hum of the streetlights and the occasional passing newspaper delivery truck. Sarah Jenkins stood on the sidewalk opposite, a thermos of coffee in her hand, her cameraman, Leo, checking his equipment beside her. "You sure about this?" Leo asked, his breath misting in the cool air. "This could be a prank call." "My gut says no," Sarah replied, her eyes fixed on the empty street. At precisely 6 a.m., she heard it. It began as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving itself into the distinct, syncopated thunder of V-twin engines. It was not the sound of a few bikes. It was the sound of an entire armored cavalry. The first motorcycles appeared at the end of the block, 2 riders leading the way. Behind them, 2 more, and then a flood. They poured into the street in a perfect, staggered formation, a river of chrome and black leather. They moved with an unnerving, disciplined slowness. They weren't racing or revving their engines. They were making an entrance. The column flowed into the precinct's large parking lot, splitting into 2 wings that circled around and filled the designated spaces with military precision. 72 Hell's Angels. They came to a stop, and in a single, coordinated movement 72 engines were cut. The sudden, absolute silence that followed was more shocking than the noise. It was a weighted, powerful quiet that seemed to suck the air from the street. Doors to the precinct opened. Cops on the morning shift change paused, coffee cups halfway to their lips, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. They saw the vests, the patches, the sheer, overwhelming number of men, and their hands instinctively moved toward their service weapons. But the bikers just sat there, astride their silent machines, gloved hands resting on their fuel tanks. No weapons were visible. No threats were made. They were a statue of silent condemnation. At the head of the formation, Preacher dismounted. He moved without haste, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the asphalt. He was joined by Marcus Thorne, who looked pale and exhausted but stood tall, his eyes locked on the front doors of the building. This was the public confrontation. It wasn't a protest. It was an audit. The hypocrisy was laid bare for all to see. The system that had ignored a father's frantic pleas for his missing 7-year-old girl was now on high alert, faced with a perfectly lawful assembly of men who had simply shown up. Sarah Jenkins signaled to Leo. The camera's red recording light blinked on. "We're live," she whispered. Detective Carver arrived at 6:15 a.m., his silver sedan pulling into his reserved spot. He got out, a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand and a briefcase in the other, grumbling about the morning traffic. Then he saw it. His stride faltered. He stopped dead, the coffee sloshing over his hand. His face, normally a mask of bored indifference, went slack with disbelief, which quickly curdled into fear. He saw 72 stone-faced men in motorcycle cuts staring at him. He saw the news camera pointed directly in his face. And he saw Marcus Thorne, the grieving father he had dismissed as a nuisance, standing beside the imposing figure at the center of it all. Preacher took a deliberate step forward. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a clear plastic folder, the kind used for reports. Inside, Marcus could see the shard of taillight, the USB drive, and neatly printed pages of notes. "Detective Carver." Preacher's voice was calm, but it carried across the silent parking lot like a judge's gavel. "This man is Marcus Thorne. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You work for him. You work for all of them." He gestured to the quiet houses and apartment buildings surrounding them. "This is his daughter's file. You've had it for more than 2 days. You called it a waste of resources," in front of Sarah Jenkins' rolling camera. Broadcasting live to a rapidly growing online audience, Preacher began to dismantle Carver's inaction piece by piece. "This," he said, holding up the baggie with the red plastic, "is a taillight fragment from a late-model Audi A8. The part number is right here. My people identified it in 20 minutes. He then held up the USB drive. "This is security footage of the abduction. You called it blurry. One of our brothers works in digital forensics. He spent last night cleaning it up." From the silent ranks of bikers, a man stepped forward with a laptop. He opened it and turned the screen toward Carver and the camera. The footage played, now sharpened and clarified. The license plate was no longer a blur. The numbers and letters were crisp, legible. The man read them aloud, his voice steady and clear. "The plate is registered to a shell corporation. That corporation is owned by Croft Development Group." A murmur went through the assembled police officers. The Croft family was one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the state, with a reputation for burying their problems under mountains of money and political influence. Silas Croft, the youngest son, was notoriously unstable. Carver's mask of authority crumbled completely. His face was pale, his eyes darting around for an escape. The mask that dropped was not just his own, but the system's. It revealed the ugly truth beneath, that justice in this city was not blind, but had a price tag. It was a commodity available to the powerful, while men like Marcus Thorne were left with nothing. The police chief, a portly man named Barrows, stormed out of the precinct, his face purple with rage. "What is the meaning of this? Disperse this illegal gathering immediately." But Preacher didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Carver. "We're not a gathering," Preacher said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "We're witnesses, and we're waiting for you to do your job." The live feed from Sarah Jenkins' camera was a digital wildfire. The link was shared thousands of times in minutes. The image was stark and compelling. A lone father, backed by a silent army of bikers, confronting a wall of official indifference. The phones at City Hall began ringing off the hook. The mayor's office, which had been oblivious to Lily Thorne's existence an hour earlier, was now in full-blown crisis mode. The public pressure was immense and instantaneous. Chief Barrows, realizing he was losing control of the narrative in front of a massive online audience, was forced to act. He couldn't let his department be seen to capitulate to the bikers, but he also couldn't ignore the evidence being laid out on live television. The enhanced license plate number was undeniable. He made a call not to his own detectives but to the state police. It was a tacit admission that his own house was not in order. Within the hour, a state police tactical team was scrambled. 2 black armored vans, sirens screaming, bypassed the 12th precinct entirely and headed for the sprawling Croft estate in the hills overlooking the city. They breached the gates and swarmed the main house. The raid was swift and professional. They found Silas Croft in a den, clearly under the influence, babbling incoherently. And in a soundproofed guest room in a separate wing of the house, they found Lily. She was sitting on a large bed, surrounded by expensive dolls she hadn't touched, her face stained with tears. She was physically unharmed, but her eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond childhood fear. The reunion happened back at the state police barracks, away from the media circus that had descended on the local precinct. Marcus ran to her, and she leaped into his arms, her small body trembling. He buried his face in her hair and just held her, whispering her name over and over. He didn't cry. The relief was too profound, too overwhelming for tears. It was a quiet, sacred moment of restoration. From across the street, the Hells Angels watched the news on their phones. They saw the footage of Lily being carried out of the mansion by a state trooper. They saw Silas Croft being led away in handcuffs. Their job was done. They didn't cheer or celebrate. Preacher gave a single, sharp nod. One by one, the engines rumbled back to life. They pulled out of the parking lot as quietly and professionally as they had arrived, melting back into the city's traffic. Justice had been delivered, not by a flawed system, but because 72 men had refused to be silent. Back at the 12th precinct, the fallout was just beginning. Detective Carver was placed on administrative leave, his badge and weapon confiscated pending an internal affairs investigation into dereliction of duty and obstruction of justice. The public exposure had shattered the protective shell of the Croft family's influence. The law, finally spurred to action, would now have to run its course. The story of the 72 bikers became a local legend overnight, a modern folktale of how focused, righteous anger could move an immovable system. But its impact rippled far beyond talk and headlines. Sarah Jenkins' reporting won a regional award for investigative journalism, and the public outcry she had sparked forced a complete overhaul of the city's missing persons protocols. The 24-hour waiting period for children was abolished. In its place, the city council, under immense public pressure, passed a new ordinance mandating an immediate, full-scale response to any credible child abduction report. They called it Lily's Law. The law was more than just a procedural change. It was a shift in institutional philosophy, a recognition that every child's life was a resource worth every effort to protect. Marcus Thorne, thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, found a new purpose. He couldn't go back to the quiet anonymity of his old life. He felt a debt not just to Preacher and his men, but to any other parent who might one day find themselves in his position. Working with Preacher, he helped establish a nonprofit foundation called Riders for the Lost. It was an unprecedented partnership. The local Hells Angels chapter, along with other motorcycle clubs in the region, created a volunteer network. They offered their organizational skills and manpower to law enforcement as a civilian auxiliary in search and rescue operations for missing children. They provided logistical support, spread awareness, and acted as a rapid response search party, all in official coordination with the police departments that had once viewed them with suspicion. The foundation became a bridge between two worlds that had never trusted each other, proving that a code of honor could be a powerful force for good. The enduring symbol of the entire event was a photograph taken by Sarah's cameraman, Leo, that morning. It showed the 72 motorcycles parked in perfect, silent rows, facing the precinct like a jury, the rising sun glinting off their chrome. The photo went viral and was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It came to represent the story's central theme, that true justice sometimes requires the courage of ordinary people to lawfully assemble and demand accountability when the systems designed to protect them fail. Months later, on a bright Saturday afternoon, Marcus and Lily were in the park. She was laughing, chasing a butterfly across the grass, the shadow of her ordeal finally beginning to recede. Marcus watched her, a quiet gratitude filling his chest. A low rumble turned his head. A group of about a dozen motorcycles rode past on the adjacent street. At the front was Preacher. He saw Marcus and Lily. He didn't stop or call out. He simply raised a gloved hand from his handlebar and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a sign of respect. Promise kept. Lily saw him and waved enthusiastically. Marcus lifted his own hand and nodded back, a silent acknowledgement passing between the two men, a mechanic and a biker, bound by a code that had saved his world. The rumble of the engines faded down the street, no longer a sound of intimidation, but a comforting reminder that in this city, guardians were always watching.